The stench was the first thing that hit Detective Ethan Vance. Not the coppery tang of fresh blood, nor the sour decay of something long dead, but a cloying, sweet rot, like overly ripe fruit left sweating in the sun. A scent far too heavy for the chilled October air. It was to 17 a.m. when the call came in. Code 187, possible GSW. Multiple victims, abandoned railway depot, Sector Delta. Vance was already at the precinct, running on stale coffee and the quiet hum of the night shift. He was a man carved from granite and fatigue, known for his methodical calm in the face of the city's worst horrors. But tonight felt different. The air in the car felt thick, almost resistant. The location was the old Blackwood Rail Depot, a skeletal ruin of rusted iron and shattered glass, miles from the nearest residential area. It was where the city came to die and where the darkness came to hide. Vance and his partner, Officer Maya Ramirez, arrived to find a single patrol car, Unit 412, parked haphazardly near the main loading dock. The officer inside, a young rookie named Miller, was leaning out of the door, dry heaving onto the gravel. Miller. Status. Vance barked, stepping out. Miller struggled to catch his breath, his flashlight beam trembling. Detective, it's bad. I secured the perimeter. They're inside, in the main warehouse. Who called it in? Ramirez asked, pulling on her latex gloves. No one, ma'am. Silent alarm tripped. Maintenance only uses that sector for storage. No one should be out here. I found the door, detective. It wasn't broken. It was cut. Vance moved to the massive steel loading door. Sure enough, near the lock was a gash, not forced open, but surgically carved. The metal was curled back like a peeled can, the edges impossibly clean. Ramirez, stay with Miller. Call for backup and CSI. But tell them to hold a half-mile back until I give the all-clear, Vance commanded. He pulled his 6 Sauer, the cool steel of familiar weight in his hand, and slipped through the jagged opening. The warehouse interior was an echoing, cavernous space draped in shadows. Dust motes danced in the single beam of Vance's flashlight, illuminating towering stacks of crates and forgotten machinery. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of moisture somewhere far off. And the smell. It was overwhelming now, that sweet, sickening perfume. Then, he found the first victim. It wasn't a body. Not exactly. It was the victim's clothing. A full set of work uniform, jeans, t-shirt, and heavy utility jacket, neatly folded on a crate in the center of a small, illuminated circle of floor. On top of the pile rested a wallet and a wedding ring. The clothes were stiff, but not with blood. They were saturated with that syrupy, awful smell. Vance slowly panned his light around the immediate area. No blood spatters, no struggle marks, no footprints but his own. It was a sterile, baffling scene. He moved on, his pulse beginning to beat a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He counted 3 more identical piles of neatly folded clothing, each complete with ID, keys, and personal effects. 4 people vanished. He checked his radio, whispering, Ramirez, I'm inside. 4 piles of clothes. No bodies. No blood. I need a visual on the floor plan now. This is a containment situation. Ramirez's voice crackled back, tight and stressed. Detective, I'm checking the archived schematics now. Be advised, Miller is getting spooked. He keeps saying he heard scratching. Vance ignored the rookie and continued deeper into the structure, passing under a massive overhead rail system. And that's when he saw it. It wasn't another pile of clothes. It was a trail. A glistening, sticky trail of clear, yellowish residue, like hardened tree sap. leading away from the fourth pile and snaking up one of the massive steel support columns. Vance aimed his light up the column. About 30 feet above him, clinging to the beam just beneath the rafters, was the fifth victim. Or what used to be the fifth victim. The man was suspended, not by rope or wire, but embedded in a thick, umber casing of the same sickly sweet material. He was positioned head down, arms outstretched, his mouth stretched into a silent, wide, horrified scream. But the horror wasn't his posture. The horror was what was missing. The casing had formed a seamless, clear cocoon around the man's entire body, except for one perfectly circular hole over the center of his chest. Through the hole, Vance could see the cavity where the man's heart should have been. It was gone. The surrounding tissue was clean, smooth, and oddly dry. As Vance stared up, paralyzed by the impossible sight, a soft, wet sound echoed from the high shadows. A slow, deliberate drip. He raised his light higher, sweeping it across the rafters, and the beam caught something large, dark, and impossibly wrong moving in the skeletal structure of the ceiling. Something that was absorbing the shadows instead of reflecting them. And then, a sound that wasn't a drip, but a faint, high-pitched whirring, like a massive insect cleaning its mandibles. Vance's flashlight beam suddenly flickered, then died, plunging him into absolute, suffocating darkness and silence. Click. The safety on his 6th hour was off. He was alone, and he was being watched. His radio crackled again, loud in the darkness. It wasn't Ramel's. It was a new voice, digitized and low, cutting through the police frequency. He won't need that. The rest is for later. The voice, low and synthesized, was gone as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a silence far colder than the darkness it inhabited. Vance to Ramel's. Repeat, Vance to Ramel's. Acknowledge. Nothing. The radio on his shoulder strap remained inert, emitting only static silence. It wasn't dead. It was severed. The digital voice had somehow hijacked the channel, then jammed it. He won't need that. The words echoed in his mind, chilling him more than the thought of the creature above. He fumbled in his utility vest and found his tactical backup penlight. The weak beam cut a narrow, anxious cone in the void. It was enough to see the glistening trail of hardened residue, the umber trail, leading up the support column. It seemed thicker now, almost pulsing in the periphery of his vision. He backed away slowly from the column, his eyes glued to the dark space above where the whirring had been. He could feel the pressure of the unseen presence, the silent, absolute focus of something intelligent and predatory. He needed to get out. He needed the air, the sound of Ramirez's voice, the distant blue flash of police lights. As he reached the section where the 4 piles of clothing lay, he noticed something he had missed in his initial, adrenaline-fueled sweep. The folded clothes were not just saturated with the sweet smell. They were dissolving. The fabric was stiff at the edges, but near the center of the fold, the cotton was breaking down, turning into a fibrous pulp. As if something had drawn the very essence from them. He realized the horror wasn't the extraction of the heart. It was the process of the extraction. The sweet, cloying smell was a digestive agent. It was the precursor to the cocoon. He lowered his penlight to the cracked concrete floor near the 4th pile. He swept the beam slowly, searching for the source of the clear, yellowish substance. He found it near a rusted floor grate. From beneath the grate, barely visible in the weak light, a thin, almost translucent strand, like super strong fishing line, coated in the umber residue, was slowly retracting back into the darkness below. It was the 5th victim's lifeline. Ramirez, where are you? Vance hissed into his dead radio, turning in a full circle, his 6-hour tracking phantom movements. I'm compromised. I need a tactical retreat now. He moved toward the jagged door opening, his boots crunching on the industrial dust. The feeling of being watched intensified, shifting from a general dread to a specific point behind him. He was 10 feet from the exit when the sounds began again. Not the whirring from the ceiling, but the scratching Miller had reported. It started low, beneath the floor, right where the strand had retracted. Scritch, scritch. But then it wasn't just below. It was in the concrete walls surrounding him. It wasn't the sound of a rodent, but of dozens of sharp, chitinous nails scoring stone, moving in unison, like an entire swarm circling, tunneling just out of sight. Vance aimed his weapon at the nearest wall section, his finger tightening on the trigger. He wasn't afraid of the bullets failing to penetrate the wall. He was terrified of what would spill out if they did. The scratching stopped abruptly. Silence rushed back in, heavy and absolute. Then, from the far, dark corner of the warehouse, a new sound began. A rhythmic, wet thump, like something very large, very heavy, and very soft impacting the concrete floor every few seconds. Thump, thump, thump. The penlight beam flickered over to the sound. The light was too weak, the distance too great. But the rhythm was moving, getting closer, faster. Vance took one step back toward the exit, and his foot caught on something yielding. He looked down, his penlight illuminating the obstacle. It was Officer Miller's service helmet, visor facing up. The visor was shattered, cracked from the inside out, and coated entirely in a fine, silver dust that shimmered faintly in the weak light. Miller wasn't outside with Ramirez. Before Vance could process the sickening implication that the rookie had come in, been taken, and Ramirez was now alone. The rhythmic thumping stopped directly in front of him. He raised his eyes from the helmet. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel the sudden, massive drop in temperature, the immediate, painful pressure on his eardrums. Then, he felt the sickeningly sweet, heavy air rush past his face, as if something enormous had just inhaled, right where the darkness was thickest. A voice, not digital this time, but a wet, throaty whisper, impossibly close, slithered into his ear, smelling of rot and honey. You brought the others to the edge of the web. Such a good detective. The hot, wet breath smelling of honey and putrefaction hit Vance like a physical blow. Instinct took over. He dropped low, sweeping his legs out and firing his weapon blindly into the blackness where the voice had been. Crack. 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 The shots echoed deafeningly in the enclosed space. The pressure on his eardrums immediately vanished, replaced by the loud, ringing aftermath of the gunfire. He scrambled backward toward the exit, his eyes desperately adjusting to the gloom. He saw nothing substantial. No body, no shape, only a shimmering, heat-distorting ripple where the creature must have been. Recalling with impossible speed. He reached the jagged opening and dove through, crashing onto the gravel outside. Ramirez, get out. We have to leave now. He staggered to his feet, weapon aimed at the warehouse door, and looked for Unit 412 and his partner. The patrol car, Unit 412, was still there. Its lights were still flashing, casting rotating beacons of red and blue across the desolate depot. But Officer Ramirez was gone. Vance ran to the car. The driver's side door was wide open, swinging slightly in the cold air. He checked the back seat, then the trunk. Empty. The only sign of a struggle was near the passenger side door. The ground was scuffed, and the heavy plastic clipboard Ramirez used for her notes lay cracked on the asphalt. Next to it, there was a fresh splash of the same umber, syrupy residue. It wasn't a large quantity, just a few thick, sticky drops, like something had been briefly, violently contained. Vance snatched up his radio from his harness. It was still silent. He grabbed the car's mic, stabbing the transmit button. Central, this is Detective Vance. Unit 412 is down. Officer Ramirez is missing. I repeat, Officer Ramirez is missing. Suspect is non-human and armed. Send immediate backup and Hazmat to Blackwood Depot. Now, only silence and static answered him. The entire area was jammed. The creature wasn't just physical. It was capable of controlling the environment. He lowered the mic, his mind racing. The creature had called him a good detective for bringing the others to the edge of the web. He hadn't brought anyone. They had been drawn here by the silent alarm. But the creature seemed to believe he was a part of the process. He glanced back at the massive steel door of the warehouse. He had to assume Ramuels was still alive, contained, like the fifth victim. He wouldn't leave her. He ran back to the jagged entrance. But before he could re-enter, he heard a new, terrifying sound. A series of faint, high-pitched tapping sounds coming from the warehouse's upper windows. A long row of grimy glass panes 30 feet up. Vance looked up. Raising his backup penlight. He saw the reflection of the flashing blue and red lights on the glass. The tapping was Ramirez. She was visible in one of the central windows, her face pressed against the glass. Her eyes were wide, panicked saucers. She wasn't tapping with her hands. They were pinned to her sides. She was tapping with her forehead. Desperately. She mouthed words at him, words that made Vance's blood run cold. The nest. Suddenly, a massive, shadowy shape surged up from the unseen depths of the warehouse floor, eclipsing the window. It moved with the vertical, terrible speed of an elevator. The shape was amorphous, vast, and studded with what looked like dozens of gleaming, obsidian eyes. Ramirez's panic tapping stopped instantly. The massive shadow paused directly behind her. And Vance saw, in stark silhouette, two long, segmented appendages, like enormous, jointed legs tipped with hooks, reach out and gently cradle Ramirez's head against the glass. The appendages did not pierce the glass. Instead, where the hook-like tips touched the window pane, the glass instantly fogged, dissolved, and then sealed itself with a film of the umber residue. Then, slowly, deliberately, the shadow drew Ramirez back into the darkness. Vance stood frozen. His adrenaline spiked into a painful, useless peak. He knew he had seconds before the creature sealed the exit or came. For him. He ran to the exterior walls of the depot, searching for any other entrance. The building was a fortress of concrete and sheet metal. He spotted a smaller, locked personnel door about 50 yards down, near the old boiler room. He sprinted towards it, reaching the door. It was bolted from the inside. He planted his shoulder and smashed it once, twice. The steel held fast. He pulled back, ready for a third assault, when he noticed something on the ground near his feet. A single, dried, brown moth. It was gigantic, easily the size of his hand, with impossibly intricate, black and silver scales. It was clearly dead, its wings curled and brittle. As Vance stared at it, he realized the moth hadn't died naturally. It looked like it had been violently compressed and then discarded. He reached down and picked it up. As he turned the moth over, he saw that its abdomen was split open, and inside, glistening with the umber residue, was a tiny, intricately carved bone charm, the size of a thumbnail. It was shaped like an insect, perhaps a beetle or a scorpion. A cold certainty settled over Vance. This wasn't just a monster. This was a hunter with a pattern, a ritual, and possibly a collector's instinct. The victims were food, but the hearts and the resulting chitinous remains were trophies. And the voice. You brought the others to the edge of the web. The creature hadn't just jammed the radio. It had used the alarm to lure the police, the watchers, into its web. The police were not merely cleanup crew. They were the bait. He slammed his shoulder into the door one last time. The ancient lock screamed in protest, and the door burst inward, plunging Vance into the stale, suffocating heat of the boiler room. He was inside the fortress again. He was one step closer to the nest, and 2 steps closer to becoming another pile of folded clothes. As he moved through the darkness toward the main warehouse floor, he heard the faint, high-pitched whirring again, this time much closer. And it wasn't the sound of cleaning. It was the sound of preparation. The boiler room was a cramped, sweltering tomb of hissing pipes and obsolete machinery. The heat was a tangible, oily presence that fought the chill of the night. Vance moved cautiously, his penlight darting over the heavy iron fixtures. The whirring sound was definitely closer now, amplified by the metal structure of the room, vibrating through the soles of his boots. It sounded like 100 delicate machines running simultaneously, a biological engine working at high speed. He moved past 3 immense, dormant steam tanks. As he reached the 4th, he stopped dead. The creature's presence was strongest here. The air shimmered with heat, and the sweet, sick smell of the residue was almost suffocating. Vance aimed his light at the massive tank. The steel was covered in a thick, wet patina of the umber substance. It wasn't just smeared on, it was growing, forming complex, interlocking, hexagonal patterns across the surface, like an organic form of chainmail. The tank was being colonized. He stepped closer, his heart hammering. He saw a tear in the umber coating near the bottom of the tank and peered into the opening. The tank wasn't empty. It was filled with a gelatinous, pulsing fluid that glowed faintly. And suspended in the fluid were dozens of those gigantic, dried moths, spinning slowly. They were all identical to the one he had found outside, perfectly formed, but dead. This was a chitin hatchery. The creature was harvesting something from the moths. Vance then noticed movement near the floor. He aimed his light down. The entire concrete floor around the tank was cracked and vibrating. Thin, black threads, finer than hair, were emerging from the cracks, testing the air. These were not spider silk. They were biological wires, coated in the same metallic sheen as the silver dust on Miller's helmet. He moved away quickly, stepping over a collapsed workbench. On the bench, amidst a scattering of rusted tools, he found a notebook. It was a maintenance log, dated 5 days ago, belonging to one of the missing workers. Vance flipped it open. The last entry was written in frantic, almost illegible handwriting. The smell is getting worse. Like industrial honey. The door won't open. Heard scratching from the ceiling. Didn't call central. Saw it on the security monitors. Not a man. Not a rat. It's got too many. The sentence ended abruptly. Below it, scribbled in a shaky hand, were a series of crude, geometric drawings. They were repeating, multifacet shapes. The obsidian eyes Vance had seen in the silhouette. But the final sketch was the most terrifying. A depiction of the creature's entire form, seen from below. It was roughly humanoid in size, but impossibly thin, stretched, and segmented. Its primary feature was the way its arms and legs merged seamlessly into the wall, covered in the umber armor. The creature's body was a living conduit. Vance turned the page. The final sheet of the log was blank, except for a large smear in the center. It was fresh, still slightly viscous, and metallic silver. He had found the creature's camouflage, its blood, or its digestive secretions. The silver dust. Suddenly, the whirring reached a fever pitch, accompanied by a hideous grinding sound. The sound of tons of steel shifting. Vance realized he wasn't alone in the boiler room. From the immense steam tank he had just inspected, a section of the hexagonal umber carapace slowly began to peel back. The opening wasn't wide enough for a human, but it was wide enough for something else. Out of the rent in the carapace slid a single, massive, segmented arm. It was dark, glossy chitin, wet with the sweet residue, and ended not in a hand, but in a cluster of 5 needle-sharp, bony lancets. The lancets tested the air, clicking softly, sensing the heat from Vance's body. The arm was easily 7 feet long and moved with unnatural speed and precision. Vance ducked behind a stack of oil barrels as the arm swept toward him. The lancet sliced through the air, hitting the steel wall behind the barrels with a sound like splintering bone. He knew he couldn't outrun the thing in the cramped space. He had to hit it where it lived. He pulled the pin on a flashbang grenade from his vest. He didn't want to kill the creature, not yet. He needed to find Ramirez. He just needed light, disorientation, and a path to the main warehouse floor. He tossed the grenade over the barrels. The flashbang detonated with a blinding, deafening white light and an ear-shattering concussion. In the fraction of a second the light illuminated the tank. Vance saw it. Dozens of the silver-coated black threads retracting violently into the umber carapace, pulling the segmented arm back in. The bright light had been an intense shock to the sensitive, myriad eyes. Vance vaulted the barrels and sprinted towards the internal door leading to the main warehouse. He kicked it open and burst through, his ears ringing, his eyes watering, weapon ready. He was back in the enormous, dark warehouse. But it was no longer silent. He looked up toward the rafters where Ramirez had been. The massive silhouette was gone, but where the fifth victim had been hanging, there was now fresh, shimmering cocoon. And from the center of the warehouse floor, where the folding process had occurred, a long, wide trench had been cut into the concrete. A crude, gaping tunnel. And from the tunnel, he could hear the sound of soft, wet sobbing. It was a woman's voice. Ramirez. Vance aimed his penlight down into the mouth of the tunnel. The sobbing stopped instantly. Instead, a chilling, high-pitched skittering sound, the movement of dozens of segmented legs, began rising up from the darkness, rushing toward the surface. Vance realized it wasn't Ramirez sobbing. It was bait. He raised his six sauer, waiting for the swarm to emerge, knowing he was at the final entrance to the nest. The skittering grew louder, a frantic, horrifying chatter climbing up the tunnel walls. Vance pressed himself against the cold concrete lip of the trench, ready to empty his magazine into whatever emerged. Instead of a swarm, a single figure clawed its way out of the darkness. It was Officer Miller. His uniform was torn, coated in the pervasive silver dust and the sticky umber residue. His face was a mask of utter terror, his eyes dilated to pinpoints. He wasn't crawling, he was scrambling, using his elbows and knees in a desperate, broken movement. "Detective, get back," Miller gasped, his voice thin and ragged. "It's not one. They were them." Miller collapsed onto the floor, his body shaking uncontrollably. But before Vance could reach him, the officer's body went rigid. His back arched violently, and a series of sharp snaps echoed in the warehouse, the sound of his own skeletal structure being compromised. From the sleeve of Miller's uniform, an impossibly thin, segmented appendage, coated in silver dust, shot out and embedded itself into the officer's neck, exactly where his carotid artery pulsed. Miller's head snapped towards Vance. But the expression was no longer human. The eyes were glazed, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque, inhuman smile. The digitized voice from the radio echoed chillingly from Miller's throat. "The detective is highly motivated. He feeds the queen best." Vance fired. Crack. Crack. He shot Miller twice in the chest, the rounds punching through the uniform. The body collapsed instantly, the black appendage retracting back into the sleeve with a wet sloop sound, disappearing beneath the torn fabric. Vance stood over the lifeless body, his chest heaving, adrenaline masking the shame and horror. Miller hadn't been rescued. He had been a puppet, a distraction, and an information relay. The sobbing hadn't been Ramirez. It had been the creature mimicking her distress to draw him in. He looked down into the trench. The skittering had stopped. It was silent again, the tunnel waiting like a predator's open mouth. Ramirez was down there. He had to go. Vance switched his penlight for a small, tactical headlamp and clipped it onto his collar, providing a hands-free beam. He holstered his 6 Sauer, pulling a heavier, backup service pistol. He found a coil of rope and a carabiner near the entrance, remnants of the depot's old rigging equipment. He tied the rope to a rusted support strut and carefully descended into the tunnel. The tunnel walls were not concrete and earth. They were lined with the same slick, hexagonal umber carapace seen in the boiler room. It felt slimy, yet structurally sound, like polished bone. The smell here was overpowering, sweet and chemical, making his eyes water. He was in the creature's digestive tract, or perhaps its nursery. This was the nest. The passage sloped sharply downward, spiraling into the earth. The light revealed scattered, horrifying fragments, shattered pieces of police radio equipment, shards of a shattered tactical flashlight. And then, unmistakable in the umber lining, a cluster of human bones, small bones, like fingers and toes, that had been meticulously cleaned and embedded into the wall, functioning as macabre structural reinforcement. The creature wasn't just extracting, it was building. The air grew progressively thicker, hotter, and incredibly humid. Vance estimated he had descended at least 50 feet when the passage opened into a vast, central cavern. Vance shielded his eyes against the oppressive, dark dome. The ceiling was too high to see, but the entire space was illuminated by a sickly, pulsing green light emanating from the center of the chamber. And at the center, on a raised dais formed entirely of the umber substance, was Ramiruz. She was encased in a fresh, translucent cocoon, just like the 5th victim. She was upright, her eyes fluttering, clearly conscious but immobilized. The cocoon was thinner, fresher, and covered in a network of fine, silver threads that were vibrating, drawing energy or substance from her body. "Ramils, hold on," Vance yelled, his voice sounding weak in the cavernous space. He started running toward her, navigating the slick, uneven floor. That's when the casing began to move. The dais Ramiruz was suspended on was not a pedestal. It was the crown of the true creature, the queen. From the sides of the dais, massive, chitinous plates began to unfold. They were the color of polished mahogany, segmented like a lobster, and covered in swirling, fractal patterns of silver dust. The queen's body was easily 20 feet in diameter, low to the ground, and its center was dominated by a pulsing, sickeningly green sac that was drawing the silver threads from Ramirez. And all over the cavern walls, in countless crevices and under ledges, hundreds of the smaller, segmented creatures, the ones that had worn Miller, began to emerge. They were the size of large dogs, all legs and gleaming obsidian eyes, skittering and clicking across the umber walls. This wasn't a monster. This was an ecosystem. The queen let out a sound, not the digital voice, not the wet whisper, but a deep, rumbling vibration that shook the umber floor beneath Vance's feet. A giant, secondary appendage, far larger than the one in the boiler room, slowly uncalled from the queen's underside. It was thicker than Vance's torso, tipped with a massive, needle-like lancet. The appendage lifted, slowly aiming itself not at Vance, but at the delicate, translucent cocoon surrounding Ramirez. Vance stopped running. He raised his weapon at the colossal queen, realizing he only had one option to save his partner. He had to strike at the center of the web. He squeezed the trigger. Vance didn't aim for the massive queen herself. He aimed for the weak point at the heart of the system, the pulsing green sac. Boom, boom, boom. 3 shots from his backup sidearm tore through the cavern air and slammed into the sac. Instead of blood or any organic fluid, a burst of dense, freezing white vapor roared out of the wounds. The queen didn't scream in pain. She answered with a piercing, electric shriek, like an overloaded generator on the verge of rupture. The green sac went still at once. The silver threads running from Ramirez slackened. But the queen was not mortally wounded. She was enraged. The enormous limb tipped with the injector pivoted away from Ramirez and lashed toward Vance with terrifying speed. He dove aside, barely clearing it. The injector spike punched into the umber floor with a sharp, splintering crack, shattering the hardened shell and releasing a slow spill of fresh umber fluid that pooled into a thick, adhesive trap. At the same time, the workers emerged. Hundreds of them, each the size of a dog, poured out from fractures in the walls. They didn't rush Vance. They sprinted toward the damaged green sack. They clustered tightly, excreting a clear, adhesive fluid, trying to seal and repair the rupture. Vance understood. The Queen was the processing center. The workers were her repair and defense units. He fired 2 more rounds into the mass of workers surrounding the sack, but the bullets glanced off. Their chitin armor was too heavy. He needed more force. Then he saw it. Something glinting on the claw of a nearby worker. A tiny bone charm, the same kind he'd found in the giant moth outside. Bone charms. Trophies. A collector's instinct. An insane idea sparked. Vance backed off, not to run, but to sprint toward a corner of the chamber where he'd spotted a heap of rusted metal from old track rails. As he ran, the Queen launched a new attack. Thin streams of shimmering silver vapor bled from the seams of her exoskeleton, curling through the air. The gas knifed straight toward Vance's face. The instant he inhaled even a trace of it, dizziness crashed over him, a metallic taste flooding his mouth. Sedative. Neurotoxin. The creature didn't want to kill him outright. It wanted him intact. He clamped his mouth shut, held his breath, vaulted over the scrap pile, and wrenched a heavy rail bar free with everything he had. Spinning back, he lifted it like a spear. He didn't throw at the Queen. He threw at the structure holding Ramirez. The rail flew end over end and drove deep into the umber shell, burying itself inches from Ramirez's head. Escari, the impact shattered a lattice of umber channels, releasing a surge of thick resin. Ramirez's cocoon cracked. The Queen went berserk. The workers abandoned the green sack in a frenzy. The injector arm hammered wildly at the embedded rail, trying to dislodge it, trying to stabilize the system. In that window of chaos, Vance rushed the cocoon and tore at the fractured shell. The umber split, and Ramirez dropped into his arms, her body limp and ice-cold. "Ethan, the core," she whispered, voice thin, eyes fixed on a point on his chest. Vance looked down. The small bone charm he'd taken from the moth was hooked in the fabric of his vest. The Queen, this monstrous architect, went suddenly still. The massive injector halted inches from Vance's chest. The workers froze mid-advance. Every one of them was staring at the bone charm. The Queen emitted a low, resonant sound, no longer the electrical shriek, but something heavier. Recognition. Vance understood. The bone charm was not a souvenir. It was a key. He stared at it, then at Ramirez as clarity bled back into her eyes. "Core. The core is the heart," Ramirez rasped. "It's not just collecting hearts. It uses the purest, strongest fear to synthesize that umber. The bone charm is a piece of the previous host." Cold swept through Vance. This thing wasn't just some insect hive. It was an intelligent biological entity, hunting distilled fear and using the strongest prey, police officers, protectors, fighters, to refine its material. The charm was proof, a relic from another cop who hadn't made it out. The Queen shifted, not to strike, but to reach. One of her worker limbs delicately pried the rail bar loose from the floor and set it down beside Vance. An offer. Vance realized the truth. It didn't want to kill him. It wanted to replace its damaged core. It had seen his resolve, his fear, harnessed instead of surrendered. He was, to this thing, a candidate. Vance tightened his hold on Ramirez, rose, and leveled his gun at the Queen. "You're not taking anyone else," he growled. The queen shrieked, and every vent along her carapace jetted a storm of silver anesthetic vapor. The workers surged forward again, this time in full assault. Vance knew he couldn't win that fight. He had one option left: escape. He hurled his tactical flashlight straight at the queen. It shattered against her shell with a sharp crack. The chamber plunged into darkness. In the last frozen frame of light before it died, Vance saw what was coming. Hundreds of workers rushing him. And behind them, the green sack, already resealed, where the queen was spinning a new cocoon, man-sized, waiting, made for Detective Ethan Vance. When the tactical light shattered, darkness swallowed everything. For Vance, the blackout was worse than the sickly green glow. In it, his other senses were assaulted. The sweet chemical stench turned suffocating, nauseating. The clatter of hundreds of chitinous legs hammered through the cavern like teeth grinding on bone. "Ramils, hold on to me," Vance snarled. He hauled Ramils up across his arm. She was still shaking from the harvesting process. He raised his remaining backup pistol and fired into the dark. No aim, just noise and disruption. Bang! Bang! The shots cracked through the chamber. The skittering faltered. A few sharp, pained shrieks told him he had hit some of the workers. The worst was the silver gas. It had filled the hive. One breath and Vance felt his vision blur, his limbs turn heavy. A tailored neurotoxin, he realized, designed not to kill but to soften the mind, to make a body compliant for storage. The only way out was the way he came in, the umber-lined spiral shaft. "Up! Go up!" he shouted. He grabbed the rail bar the queen had returned to him earlier. It was brutally heavy, but in the tight confines of the shaft it became the perfect bludgeon. When the first worker leapt for his legs, he swung hard. Chitin cracked. The creature shrieked and fell. Ramirez, though weak, had clawed her way back to awareness. She clung to his belt, her voice trembling through ragged breaths. "The sack. Detective, it has to be the sack. Silver, it wants to replace." The queen no longer pursued. Vance could hear her instead. A deep, building vibration as she resumed spinning, reviving a fresh cocoon. She had deprioritized him as a threat. She had reprioritized him as material. That bought them time. They climbed. The umber shell was slick and treacherous. The workers swarmed after them, hissing, hurling clouds of pale silver gas that burned Vance's lungs and made his grip slip. Every upward pull felt like it stole something from the bottom of him. At last, drained and half-numbed, Vance saw the top of the shaft, the broken opening into the warehouse above. The rope he'd used to descend still dangled. "Grab the rope," he shouted, locking his arm tighter around Ramil's. He flung the rope up for purchase just as a larger worker, hyena-sized, vaulted up and clamped onto his leg. With a hoarse yell, Vance drove the rail bar up into its underside. The worker spasmed, vomiting a spray of black fluid before tumbling back down the shaft, dragging a cluster of others with it. Vance caught the rope, one arm wrapped around Ramil's, and heaved with the last of his strength. They spilled out of the hatch and onto the warehouse floor. Vance moved on instinct. He pulled Ramil's close, confirming she was breathing. He snatched up his Sig Sauer. He swung back to the opening, wedged the rail bar across it as a crude cross brace. Then he fired 3 rounds into the rope, severing it and sending it snaking down into the dark, cutting off the worker's fastest path up. From below, the queen roared, no longer an electronic shriek, but a raw, furious bellow. Vance didn't wait. He staggered to his feet, lifted Ramil's, and ran. They crashed through the warped warehouse doors as the first light of early morning spilled over him. The cold, clean air seeped into his lungs, thinning the poison, taking the edge off the vertigo. 4 hours later, Metropolitan General Hospital. Vance woke on a narrow bed, wired into monitors, and 4 dripping clear fluid into his arm. His head rang, his muscles ached, but his thoughts were steady. Captain Marcus Holt sat in the plastic chair beside him, rigid, exhausted, the man Vance knew for his discipline and lack of imagination. Detective Vance. You created quite a mess, Holt said, voice heavy. How's Ramils? Vance rasped. She'll live, Holt replied. Severe exhaustion, hypothermia, unknown compounds in her system. Toxicology says some kind of resin-based biogel. She was lucky. And the nest? The queen? Vance pressed. Holt exhaled. Task force hit the scene an hour ago. The warehouse was empty. The hole in the floor sealed. Vance blinked. Sealed? With what? A solid slab of hardened umber-like material. Biocement, if you want the lab term. Can't cut it with our equipment. They recovered Officer Miller's body and the missing items. Story is, Ramils was abducted by a disturbed individual with access to chemicals. No alien hive. No organism. No conspiracy. You believe that? Vance demanded. I believe in evidence, Holt said flatly. And your evidence is gone. But I did bring you something. He stood, pulled a photo from his folder, and set it on the bedside table. It was a close-up from the warehouse floor. The sealed shaft, entombed beneath that glassy umber shell. Trapped inside the hardened layer, faint but unmistakable, was a tiny, silver shape. The bone charm. The thing had sealed its own door, and its own proof, while leaving him a message. You're on mandatory leave for 2 weeks, Holt said quietly. You don't come back until Sykes signs off. He left Vance alone with the photo. Vance stared at the charm locked in umber. He hadn't entirely failed. Ramils was alive. The Queen's den was closed. But she wasn't gone. She'd relocated, reset, planned for next time. And in the hollow of his spine, Vance felt the ice-cold certainty that the man-sized cocoon she'd begun weaving for him was still waiting somewhere, unfinished. He turned his gaze to the hospital window, where the city sky shone bright and innocent. The hunt wasn't over. It had only just begun. 2 weeks of mandatory leave felt like 2 years in a vacuum. Vance's apartment, once a heaven of quiet order, now felt like a cage. He was cleared physically, minor lacerations, acute smoke inhalation, and a suspiciously high level of trace chemical compounds that the hospital officially logged as industrial solvent. But mentally, he was haunted. He spent his days poring over 2 things. The maintenance logs from the Blackwood depot and the photograph of the sealed umber plug, with the bone charm forever trapped inside. Captain Holt's dismissal, hallucinations from stress and solvents, was a bullet Vance couldn't dodge officially. But he knew the truth. Ramils knew the truth. Officer Maya Ramils was recovering slowly. She had been moved to an inpatient rehabilitation facility, suffering from severe chronic fatigue and an inexplicable sensitivity to light. Vance visited her every day. On his 3rd visit, she was finally lucid enough to talk for more than a few minutes. The core, Ethan, she whispered, her voice still weak. I felt it. It wasn't just taking blood or flesh. It was taking the memory, extracting the essence of the strongest fear. When it touched my head, I saw everything. The fear of the 5th victim, the panic of the crew chief. It wasn't just eating, it was learning. Vance pulled out a notepad and drew the geometric, multifaceted eyes he had seen in the logistics log. Are these its eyes? Ramiro shuddered. No, those are the lenses. They don't see light, they see emotion. When you shot the sack, the threads disconnected. It was feeding the queen the concentrated emotion. And the silver threads, Ramils pointed weakly to her arm where the 4 was placed. They weren't threads, detective. They were nerves, bioconductors. When it cocooned me, I felt them weaving into my spine. They were hijacking my senses, making me lucid, making my fear pure. The silver dust, that's its waste product. Concentrated chitin nerve matter. Vance felt a cold wave of understanding wash over him. The creature was an organic supercomputer, processing the purest emotional energy into a biological armor and structure. The bone charm, Vance said, tapping the photo. You called it the core of the previous host. It is, Ramils confirmed, her eyes meeting his, filled with a grim determination. The host is the source, not the queen. The queen is the processing plant. The host is the original victim, the one whose pure, unadulterated fear started the hive and gave it its intelligence. The charm, it's a piece of that first policeman, a trophy, and a power source. She then dropped a final, chilling piece of information. When I was in the cocoon, I heard voices, hundreds of them, faint, overlapping whispers. They weren't the queen. They were the souls of the victims, trapped in the umber, still feeling the terror, still feeding the core. Vance sat in silence. The creature hadn't just moved. It had taken the victims with it. 2 days later, Vance was back on the streets, technically still on leave, but armed with a new purpose. He used his contacts in the city's building and utilities departments. The Blackwood depot was a dead end, sealed with a substance harder than steel. He focused on the creature's requirements. Large, secluded spaces, access to metal for the umber carapace, and an undetectable means of entry and exit. He spent his evenings driving the old railway lines, looking for other abandoned industrial sites. The creature had used the silent alarm to lure police to the depot. If it moved, it would need to establish a new, equally anonymous hunting ground. His breakthrough came when he remembered a detail from the original call. The officer, Miller, had found the door cut, not forced. The edges were impossibly clean. Vance drove to the city records archive and pulled blueprints for the city's major underground construction projects from the last decade. He found a half-dozen large-scale infrastructure projects that had been mysteriously abandoned or quietly mothballed due to unforeseen seismic activity or structural instability. One site stood out: the Ironclad Conduit Project. A massive subterranean network of storm drains and utility tunnels running beneath the oldest, most congested part of the city, the industrial waterfront. It had been abandoned 7 years ago after an unexplained series of tunnel collapses. It was the perfect new nest. Vance pulled on his old tactical gear, no longer wearing his police uniform. He placed the heavy service pistol in his holster, but he added a new piece of equipment: a specialized high-frequency sonic generator, a repurposed industrial cleaning tool. Ramans had mentioned the creature hated light and was sensitive to sound. Before leaving, he stopped by the precinct's evidence locker. He signed out the only remaining piece of pure evidence the department had collected: the gigantic, dried, silver-dusted moth from the Blackwood depot. He had the location. He had the plan. He had the bait. As Vance drove toward the waterfront, he felt the familiar, cold dread return, but mixed with a grim excitement. He was going back into the darkness. He had learned from the creature. He was no longer just the detective. He was the hunter. And he knew the most fundamental rule of the hive: the queen always needs a new host. The Ironclad Conduit Project was an enormous, forgotten scar beneath the city. Vance found the access point: a heavily reinforced service hatch in the asphalt of a deserted waterfront pier. It was secured by a heavy chain and padlock. But the lock wasn't the barrier. When he placed his hand on the damp metal hatch, he felt a faint, pulsating vibration humming beneath the steel. The creature was already here. He cut the chain and padlock with a heavy-duty hydraulic cutter, the noise screaming briefly in the night. The instant the chain snapped, the vibration beneath the hatch stopped dead. It had heard him. It was waiting. Vance dropped into the darkness, landing on a slick, muddy floor. The air was cold, damp, and mixed with the familiar, sickeningly sweet chemical scent. But stronger now, tinged with the smell of ozone and decay. He activated his headlamp. He was in a massive, unfinished utility tunnel. The walls were corrugated steel and rough-hewn concrete. Unlike the old depot, this place was vast and labyrinthine. He took his sonic generator, a flat, rectangular device, and activated it. It emitted a high-frequency, near-silent whine that was designed to disrupt the creature's delicate chitinous nervous system. He strapped it to his chest, aiming the frequency away from his own body. He moved slowly down the main tunnel, his boots splashing in the ankle-deep water. He saw the first sign of the nest's new expansion almost immediately. Along the tunnel ceiling, where concrete met steel, there was a vast, sprawling network of the fine, silver-coated threads the bioconductors Ramirez had described. They stretched out across the entire ceiling like a massive, parasitic root system, pulsating faintly with captured energy. The creature was no longer hiding its presence. It was integrating with the infrastructure. Vance realized why his radio had been jammed at the depot. The silver threads were acting as a colossal, biological signal jammer, isolating its territory. The ironclad conduit wasn't just its lair. It was its antenna. He continued deeper, passing numerous abandoned work vehicles and stacks of rusted pipes. He noticed something disturbing. The tunnel was completely silent. No dripping water, no wind, no distant city noise. The creature's presence seemed to absorb all ambient sound. He reached a junction where a dozen smaller tunnels branched off. He stopped to consult his stolen blueprint, placing the heavy moth specimen on a stack of abandoned cinder blocks. As he traced the map, a faint, almost inaudible click came from the darkness behind him. Vance didn't turn around. He reached slowly, pulling out the massive, dried moth. He gripped it tightly and threw it hard toward the sound. The moth hit the concrete wall with a dry tap. Instantly, from the shadows, an appendage shot out. It wasn't the gigantic limb of the queen, but the smaller, quicker arm of a hunter, the kind that had inhabited Miller. It snatched the moth in its lancet-tipped limb with lightning speed. The hunter paused, holding the dried trophy. It seemed to recognize the scent of the previous victim. "You're not the queen," Vance muttered, aiming his pistol toward the sound. "But you'll do." He flicked on his tactical flashlight, aiming the blinding, tight beam directly at the creature's massive, multifacet eyes. The hunter shrieked, a high, wet carrick, and recoiled violently, dropping the moth. The intense light, amplified by its lenses, momentarily disabled it. Vance fired one shot, not at its body, but at the support column next to it, severing a thick bundle of the silver threads. ZZZZZZZTTT. The creature twitched violently as the threads were cut. It then turned and fled, not deeper into the hive, but upward, scrambling straight up the steel wall towards the surface access point Vance had just used. "It's trying to seal the door," Vance realized. The hunter wasn't attacking. It was securing the perimeter, protecting the queen's operation. He ran toward the main access shaft, leaving the hunter to its task. He knew the creature's priority: defense and growth. He found the main path again and saw glow ahead. A dull, pulsating green, far stronger than the light in the last nest. He reached a clearing. A massive, circular shaft designed for a subterranean pump station. The green glow was emanating from the shaft below. But the scene here was different. There were no folded clothes. Instead, dozens of industrial power cables, thick as a man's arm, had been dragged from the ceiling, their insulation chewed away. They were all spliced into one gigantic, undulating mass of umber and silver. The queen wasn't feeding on fear alone. It was feeding on the city's power. And standing at the edge of the shaft, looking down at the immense green light, was a man. He was wearing an old, all-stained utility jacket and holding a simple clipboard. He seemed entirely unaware of Vance. Vance raised his pistol. "Stop! Police! Turn around slowly." The man turned. It wasn't a hunter. It was an older man, a depot supervisor named Arthur Keller, who had been reported missing 5 years ago. His face was pale, his eyes unfocused, but his expression was utterly calm. "Detective Vance," Keller said, his voice slow and hollow. "You're late. She requires maintenance now. The city requires rewiring." Keller then smiled, and Vance saw the impossible. A faint, silver-gray network of bioconductors was visible just beneath the skin of Keller's temples and neck, pulsating with the green light from below. Keller wasn't a victim being warned. He was a willing, integrated drone. Before Vance could react, Keller raised the clipboard and with impossible strength slammed it down onto a nearby steel plate. The concussion vibrated through the tunnel, shattering the tranquility. Keller's final, chilling words echoed as he stepped calmly, deliberately, into the green abyss. "The queen is ready for her new host. This time, you brought the location." Keller, the drone, vanished into the green glow of the shaft. Vance rushed to the edge, aiming his pistol into the corrosive light. He couldn't risk the shot. The shaft was too deep, the target too uncertain, and the light too blinding. He realized the horror. Keller wasn't just integrated, he was the scout. He had been missing for 5 years, serving the hive, maintaining the infrastructure, and guiding the queen to this new, power-rich lair. The vibration on Vance's chest, the high-frequency sonic generator, began to intensify, rattling his ribs. It was struggling to maintain frequency against the queen's own intense energy field, which seemed to be rising from the shaft. Vance had no time to process the sight. From the dark tunnels branching off, the skittering returned, louder and closer than before. The retreat of the hunter had been a distraction. Now the workers were swarming. He backed away from the shaft, bracing for the onslaught. The workers emerged in a tide of clicking, black chitin. They were smaller than the one that had warned Miller, but there were easily 50 of them, and they were organized. They didn't charge him. They charged the power cables. The workers swarmed the enormous bundle of live cables, covering them in the sticky umber residue. The purpose was clear. They were protecting the energy source, allowing the queen to feast uninterrupted. Vance raised his pistol. But before he could fire, the ground trembled violently. The tremors weren't natural. They were coming from the shaft. And with the tremors came a new sound, a high-pitched, metallic singing that cut straight through the air, overriding the sonic generator and causing a painful, piercing ache behind Vance's eyes. He dropped his pistol, covering his ears. The singing wasn't random noise. It was a complex series of overlapping, synthetic tones, each one designed to trigger a specific memory of terror. Vance saw it instantly, flashed across the back of his eyes. Not the queen's memories, but his own. He was back in his first shooting, a botched robbery where a young mother had been caught in the crossfire. The smell of the cordite, the scream, the hot, sickening feeling of failure. The queen was using the absorbed fear of her previous victims to weaponize his own mind. He staggered, fighting the rising panic. He knew he had to get the sonic generator working, or he would be completely paralyzed by his own guilt and fear. He forced his trembling hands to the device on his chest. The queen's energy field was disrupting its internal tuning. He wrenched the frequency dial, searching for a gap in the sonic attack. Meanwhile, the workers saw their chance. A squad of them detached from the power cables and darted toward Vance. As the first worker lunged, Vance found the frequency ZZZZZZZWHRRRRRRR. The generator hit a harmonic sweet spot. The high-pitched whine became a powerful, deafening, localized vibration. The effect on the workers was instantaneous and catastrophic. They recoiled as if hit by a physical wall. Their obsidian eyes shattered, and their chitinous legs curled and snapped. The insects couldn't handle the concentrated sonic assault. Their integrated nervous systems overloaded. Vance stood in the center of a swirling vortex of sound, using his own fear as fuel. He scooped up his pistol, his head throbbing, and aimed at the power cables. He emptied his clip into the massive, sticky bundle of cables. Crack. Sizzle. Flash. The short circuit was spectacular. Thousands of volts slammed through the Queen's parasitic network. The umber coating didn't immediately burn, but the silver threads vaporized in a brilliant cascade of blue-white light and sparks. The singing stopped immediately. The green light in the shaft flickered violently, then dimmed to a sickly, weak pulse. Vance had severed the Queen's power supply. He didn't wait. He knew this was merely a temporary shutdown. He sprinted toward the main shaft. Ignoring the twitching bodies of the workers. He reached the edge and looked down. The immense, circular shaft descended into an abyss, but the green light was now faint enough to see into the immediate depths. And there she was. The Queen, covering the entire floor of a subterranean chamber, her massive carapace cracked and smoking from the electrical overload. She was vulnerable. And right next to her, slowly rotating, was the newest, most perfect cocoon. It was roughly the size of a man, shimmering with a fresh, thick coat of umber. But it wasn't empty. Visible inside, in a sickening, translucent detail, was a figure, not Ramil's, not Keller, but the full, upright, preserved body of Detective Ethan Vance's mentor, Captain Marcus Holt. Holt had been captured days ago during the official cleanup. The Queen had replaced the Corps with the most disciplined, most fearless mind she could find, and was now preparing to replace him with Vance. The Queen, weakened and exposed, raised its massive, segmented head towards the faint light above. It didn't speak with a voice, but with a sudden, forceful thought that slammed into Vance's mind. The host is prepared. The detective will feed the next generation. Vance knew he had to finish this now. He had the sonic advantage and the element of surprise. He had to destroy the Queen before she could fully integrate his mentor. He holstered his pistol, pulled out the powerful hydraulic cutter, and began the terrifying descent into the silent, power-drained nest. Vance used the thick, exposed wiring bundle near the shaft edge as a makeshift rope. He slid down, the rubber insulation tearing his gloves. But the heat from the fried wiring was a welcome distraction from the chilling sight below. The Queen's chamber was vast, but dimly lit by the dying green light. The air was thick with smoke and ozone. The electric shock had damaged the creature severely. Sections of its mahogany carapace were blackened and smoking, and a multitude of obsidian eyes were dull. The immense form of the Queen dominated the floor, and nestled against its massive carapace was the new cocoon, shimmering and thick. With Captain Holt inside. Vance hit the floor, landing hard. He immediately reactivated his sonic generator, pushing the frequency to maximum overload, hoping the sheer auditory trauma would keep the Queen paralyzed. WHRRRRRRRRRRR. The noise was unbearable, even to Vance. The Queen writhed slowly, but its massive bulk was too injured and too focused on self-repair to react quickly. Vance sprinted towards the cocoon. He had to save Holt before the integration was complete. As he ran, he saw the ultimate horror. The Queen was not alone. Embedded into the ceiling of the chamber, coated entirely in hardened umber, were dozens of figures. The missing victims from the Blackwood Depot and other cold cases. They were perfectly preserved, their eyes wide in silent horror, their bodies acting as macabre structural supports and energy reservoirs for the hive. The ceiling was the hive. He reached Halt's cocoon. The umber was thick and incredibly hard. He dropped his pistol and pulled out the only tool capable of cutting through the dense biopolymer. The hydraulic cutter. He positioned the jaws around the cocoon, just above Hall's head. SHNNNKKKK crunch. The cutter strained, the hydraulic screaming. But the umber finally fractured with a loud crack. As the cocoon cracked, Vance heard Hall's voice, not in a whisper, but in a clear, authoritative shout that cut through the sonic generator's whine. Vance, the heart, not me. The heart is the fear. Destroy the core. Halt was alive, conscious, and fighting the integration. The queen, sensing the threat to its power source, finally reacted. Despite the sonic assault, a giant, segmented limb, its primary harvesting tool, shot out towards Vance. Vance ducked and rolled. The lancet missed, embedding itself deep into the umber-reinforced concrete floor. Vance looked up at Halt, his mentor's face contorted in pain and resistance. Where is it, Captain? The collection. The heart is the first sacrifice. It's in the sack. Halt yelled, pointing with his eyes towards the massive, pulsing green sack on the queen's back, the same one Vance had shot with his pistol. Vance had severed the power, but he hadn't destroyed the core. He scrambled toward the queen's carapace, dodging the flailing, lancet-tipped limb. The green sack was now dark, shriveled, and scarred from the electrical shot. It was being rapidly patched by the workers that were immune to the sonic generator's frequency. Vance reached the sack. He realized that the queen was a shell. The sack was the processor. He brought the hydraulic cutter to the scarred tissue on the sack. The material here was incredibly tough, like cured leather. He squeezed the trigger. Screech. The metal strained against the biomaterial. The queen let out a powerful, physical roar that was so loud it drowned out the sonic generator and slammed Vance backwards. He hit the floor hard, losing his grip on the cutter. It skittered across the concrete, right near the edge of the abyss where Keller had jumped. The queen, momentarily free of the sonic attack, lunged. Its massive body shifted, crushing the workers around it, focused solely on the threat Vance posed. Vance crawled desperately towards the cutter. He was seconds from being crushed. Then, from the fractured cocoon, Captain Halt managed to wrench one of his hands free, the skin coated in sticky, dissolving umber. With a primal yell, Halt slapped his hand onto the queen's carapace, right near the central sack. Halt didn't attack. He just touched it. The silver threads that were still woven into Halt's skin acted as a conduit. A powerful, internal electrical surge, the queen's last, desperate pulse of energy, shot back into Halt's hand. The queen momentarily froze. This was the distraction Vance needed. He grabbed the hydraulic cutter, dragged it back to the sack, and placed the jaws on the same scarred entry point. He squeezed the trigger, closing his eyes against the inevitable final burst of poison or acid. Caging. Crash! The cutter slammed through the carapace. It didn't find fluid or ichor. It found a small, desiccated, shriveled human heart, encased in an impossibly beautiful, diamond-like crystal of umber. The final, perfectly preserved trophy. The heart of the original host. Vance brought the cutter down one last time, aiming at the crystal heart. Shatter. The crystal heart exploded. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The green light in the chamber vanished. The hundreds of embedded victims in the ceiling instantly turned from umber-preserved structures into fine, grey ash, raining down on the chamber floor. The queen did not scream. It simply collapsed. The immense, chitinous carapace shattered, disintegrating into piles of useless dust. The hive's energy, its structure, its life, all depended on the fear contained within that one singular crystal heart. Vance, covered in dust and sweat, pulled himself up. The sonic generator had died. Silence returned, absolute and final. He rushed to Halt's shattered cocoon, cutting him free entirely. Halt was weak, but alive, breathing heavily. We did it, Vance, Halt whispered, his eyes wide, looking at the piles of grey ash that were once the hive. Vance knew they had won the battle. But the war wasn't over. The creature had used the fear of the previous host to power its existence. What if that fear had simply been released? He looked down at the site of the collapse. The hydraulic cutter had fallen, and resting on the concrete, near the pulverized remains of the crystal heart, was a single, tiny, perfectly formed, newborn charm, still glistening with fresh umber. A fresh host had been processed, and the cycle was ready to begin again. The silence in the subterranean chamber was heavier than any sound. It was the silence of something vast and terrible being irrevocably destroyed. Vance and Captain Halt, both injured and covered in the chilling grey ash, climbed out of the ironclad conduit project an hour before dawn. They left behind the ruins of the nest, shattered chitin, vaporized wiring, and the pervasive, acrid smell of burnt biological matter. Halt immediately called Central, using Vance's burner phone, choosing his words with surgical precision. We need a full hazmat and biocontainment team at the waterfront access point. Confirmed industrial accident. Massive electrical failure and fire resulting in a catastrophic collapse of a structural storage unit. Fatalities confirmed. Officer Ramarans is safe, currently at Metropolitan General. He did not mention the Queen, the workers, the Umber, or the sonic generator. He protected Vance and the truth. The cover-up 3 days later, the official report was released. The ironclad conduit disaster. The victims, the 4 workers from the Blackwood Depot and the cold case individuals, were officially categorized as having died in the tunnel collapse, their bodies vaporized by the intense electrical fire. Captain Halt, recovering from severe burns, a story they concocted to explain his injuries, enforced the narrative with an iron fist. The entire waterfront access was sealed with tons of concrete and steel. The city had learned its lesson. It was easier to bury the evidence than to explain the horror. Vance was cleared, his mandatory leave cancelled. He was back on active duty, but things had changed. He no longer saw the city as just concrete and steel. He saw the veins of the conduit, waiting to be rewired. Ramarus was released from the hospital, physically recovering but psychologically scarred. The only person Vance could truly talk to was Halt, who now shared the terrifying knowledge. We know its purpose, Vance, Halt said during a late-night debrief in a secure, unmarked location. It feeds on pure fear to power its growth. It creates the perfect host, the strongest mind, the most disciplined will, to synthesize the fear that allows its queen to evolve. And the bone charm? Vance asked, pulling the tiny, new, umber-coated insect charm from his pocket. He had kept it. Halt stared at it, his face grim. That's the ultimate problem. That is the seed. The queen is dead, but the process has been perfected. A new host was processed, the fear was extracted, and a seed was created. It's now waiting for a new environment, a new power source, and a new vulnerability. The new web 6 months passed. The city was quiet. Vance and Ramarus were partnered again, working cold cases, but always with one eye on the infrastructure. They listened to the static on their radios, always waiting for that synthesized voice to return. One rainy Friday night, Vance and Ramarus were cruising through a quiet suburban district. Their radio was silent, but Vance felt the familiar cold prickle on the back of his neck. Did you feel that? Vance asked, glancing at Ramarus. Ramarus shook her head, but her eyes were darting nervously to the shadows. Feel what, detective? The silence, Vance murmured. It's too quiet. Even the rain sounds muted. They passed a massive new construction site, the city's latest technological marvel. A completely automated, subterranean data storage facility, encased in miles of reinforced concrete, secured by the newest wireless protocols, and powered by its own massive dedicated energy grid. The site was completely deserted. Vance slowed the cruiser. Pull over, Maya. I have a bad feeling about this. As Raman sparked, they both stared up at the sheer concrete wall of the facility. It was an impregnable fortress. Then, Vance noticed it. High up on the wall, near the main ventilation shaft, barely visible in the flashing streetlight, was a small, perfectly circular patch of material. A coating. It was a faint, glistening umber shimmer. And then Raman spoke, her voice flat, her eyes wide with terror. Looking down at the dashboard where her police tablet was resting. Vance, look at the tablet. On the police tablet, a single, new message had appeared, overriding the patrol operating system. It was a digital map of the data facility's massive, subterranean cooling system. And scrawled beneath the map, in a thin, elegant, digital font that seemed to absorb the light, were three final words. Not a threat, but a statement of existence. The core is online. Vance grabbed his partner's arm. We are not going in there alone. We call halt. But before he could reach his radio, a sound came through the patrol car speakers. It wasn't the police frequency.